They had no tech, no stores, no safety nets, and yet, medieval peasants survived famine, war, disease, and winter, without backup plans, without modern tools, and often without help. They did it by mastering systems so simple, so resilient, they still work today. In this video, we'll uncover the forgotten survival manual that kept ordinary people alive in impossible times, and reveal the ancient methods being revived right now by modern homesteaders, off-gridders, and preppers alike. Stick around, because one might just save you too. Harvesting rainwater without tools. Water was life, and for medieval peasants, getting it wasn't as simple as turning on a tap. Without pipes, pumps, or filtration systems, they had to collect every drop nature gave them, and they did it with surprising efficiency. The rooftops of thatch or wooden shingles weren't just for shelter. They acted as wide catchers during every rainstorm. Gutters made from hollowed wood or clay diverted the water into barrels or large ceramic jugs, but they didn't drink it straight from the barrel. Leaves, cloth, or even moss were placed over openings to filter debris as the water flowed in. Some households dropped charcoal into the storage vessels, not for taste, but to absorb impurities. In colder climates, rainwater was often stored underground in wax-lined or clay-lined pits. These stayed cool, dark, and undisturbed, slowing the growth of bacteria and algae. Peasants instinctively knew that stagnant surface water went bad quickly, but buried water, protected from heat and sun, lasted much longer. And when the rain stopped, they didn't panic. Instead, they rationed. Water wasn't just for drinking, it was used carefully for cooking, washing, soaking grains, and even fermenting. Gray water from washing was sometimes reused to moisten soil or clean tools. Nothing was wasted. For communities without nearby rivers or wells, rain capture wasn't a convenience. It was survival. Entire village layouts were designed to funnel runoff toward shared cisterns, where neighbors took turns drawing from the same supply. This created a sense of interdependence that extended far beyond water, because when the rain stopped, no one survived alone. Today, off-grid homesteaders and eco-builders are returning to the same concepts: angled rooftops, gravity-fed systems, natural filtration. It turns out the peasants had already solved the problem centuries before we forgot how. Heating without firewood. When winter came, peasants couldn't afford to waste firewood, not when it had to be chopped, dried, hauled, and rationed. So instead of relying on flames, they learned how to trap heat and share warmth in ways that didn't burn through precious resources. One of the simplest methods was body clustering. Families, and sometimes even animals, slept close together in one room, often in shared beds, preserving body heat through the night. Straw mattresses were piled thick to insulate against the cold rising from the ground. Wool, fur, and layers of linen created air pockets that trapped warmth, while cloaks doubled as both bedding and outerwear. In colder regions, homes were dug partly into hillsides or earth embankments. These semi-subterranean shelters took advantage of the ground's natural insulation. Even when snow covered the roof, the temperature inside remained stable, cool in summer, and surprisingly warm in winter. Instead of heating an entire room, peasants often focused on warming just one spot: the bed. Stones were heated in the hearth, then wrapped in cloth or placed in clay containers and tucked under the sheets. The residual heat lasted hours and didn't cost a single log once the fire died down. Walls were packed with mud and straw to prevent drafts. Windows were covered with oiled parchment, animal bladder, or layered cloth to reduce heat loss. Even doors were lined with rush mats to block the wind. Every corner of the home was treated as a chance to hold on to warmth. In shared villages, entire families might gather in one structure for the night, not just out of camaraderie, but out of strategy. Fewer fires, more bodies, less heat lost. Modern passive heating methods like earth-sheltered homes and thermal mass floors are built on the same logic peasants once used out of necessity. When fuel runs low, insulation and shared heat aren't luxuries, they're lifelines. Cooking with almost no fuel. Firewood was precious, and peasants couldn't afford to waste it on every meal. So they developed cooking methods that stretched heat to its absolute limit. One of the most effective tools was the clay oven. Unlike an open fire, these dome-shaped ovens absorbed heat from a small batch of burning wood, then held that heat for hours. After the flames died down and the coals were removed, the residual warmth inside the clay walls was enough to bake bread, slow-cook stews, or dry herbs. Some ovens were insulated with ash or straw to hold heat even longer. Families planned meals around oven cycles. Bread went in first while the temperature was highest. Then came stews and porridges, which could simmer slowly with the fading warmth. Finally, herbs, fruits, or damp firewood were placed inside to dry overnight, wasting nothing. But it wasn't just about the oven. Cooking was often communal. Villagers gathered around a shared hearth or common oven, pooling their ingredients and firewood to cook in larger batches. This wasn't just efficient. It also meant fewer fires to tend, less wood to burn, and less smoke in the air. For those without ovens, food was cooked in heat retention pits. Stones were heated in a fire, then transferred into a covered hole lined with leaves or clay. Food was placed inside, sealed with more leaves or turf, and left to cook slowly with the trapped heat, sometimes overnight. This low-fuel, low-attention method turned tough grains and roots into edible meals using almost no extra energy. Soups and stews were a daily staple, not just for nutrition, but because they could be reheated multiple times. A single pot might be stretched across several meals, absorbing new ingredients with each boil. Today, modern preppers use thermal cookers, rocket stoves, and retained heat bags based on these same principles. Because in a crisis, cooking isn't about convenience. It's about getting the most from every spark. Foraging with precision. Peasants didn't just survive on what they grew, they survived on what they recognized. Foraging wasn't guesswork. It was a deeply honed skill passed down through generations, taught from childhood, and practiced season after season. Medieval peasants could identify dozens of wild edibles growing near their homes, even when crops failed or pantries emptied. Plants like nettle, sorrel, wild garlic, dandelion, and chickweed weren't just backup food, they were essential ingredients. Nettle, once boiled, became rich in iron and vitamin C. Sorrel added citrus-like flavor to bland stews and provided antioxidants long before the word existed. Wild garlic helped fight infections and ward off parasites. And dandelions? From root to flower, they were fully edible, used in salads, tonics, and teas. But knowing what to eat wasn't enough. Foragers had to know when to eat it. Certain plants were only safe in early spring. Others became bitter or even toxic if harvested too late in the season. Mushrooms were especially risky, and most peasants avoided them altogether unless trained by a local herbalist. They followed a seasonal rotation, foraging specific plants at precise times to avoid depleting natural supplies or poisoning themselves. Some plants were soaked or boiled multiple times to remove toxins. Others were dried and stored for winter use. Children learned to recognize edible leaves, berries, seeds, and roots not from books, but from walking the same trails with their parents and grandparents. It was a skill embedded into daily life, not just used in emergencies. Today, modern foraging is making a comeback among survivalists, herbalists, and sustainable food advocates. But for medieval peasants, it wasn't a hobby. It was their insurance policy when the field went dry, the flour ran out, or winter came early. In a world where store shelves can go empty overnight, knowing what grows under your feet might be more powerful than any stockpile. Preserving food without refrigeration. Without fridges or freezers, medieval peasants had to think ahead, way ahead. If food wasn't preserved properly, it rotted. And when winter hit or crops failed, that meant starvation. So they mastered a range of preservation methods, each tailored to the food, the season, and what little they had available. Salting was one of the most common techniques. Meat and fish were rubbed with thick layers of salt to draw out moisture and inhibit bacteria. Salted slabs were hung from beams or buried in containers where they could last for months, sometimes longer. Drying was equally vital. Peasants hung herbs, fruits, and thin slices of meat in smokehouses or near the hearth. Air-dried beans and legumes were kept in cloth sacks or ceramic jars, ready to be boiled into thick stews when fresh produce was long gone. In colder regions or winter months, food was sometimes preserved by burying it in snow or packed in ashes, which kept out air and slowed decay. Root vegetables were stored in cool cellars, sometimes nestled in straw or sand to maintain moisture and prevent rot. Grains and legumes, the backbone of peasant diets, were kept in sealed pits lined with lime or clay, protected from moisture and pests. These underground silos, while simple, kept harvests usable deep into the following seasons. Some methods were more creative. Cheese was aged to harden and resist mold. Vinegar and honey were used to pickle vegetables or preserve fruits. Even when a batch smelled strange or changed color, peasants relied on experience and smell to judge what could still be eaten. Wasting food wasn't just a mistake, it was a risk. Every piece of preserved meat or stored grain was a lifeline. And because famine was never far, storing food became an act of survival, not convenience. Today's survivalists use many of the same techniques: salt curing, dehydration, fermentation. The tech may look modern, but the wisdom is ancient. Treating illness without medicine. When illness struck, peasants didn't rush to a doctor because there wasn't one. Physicians were rare, expensive, and often far away. So families turned to something older than medicine: plants, knowledge, and ritual. They knew which herbs fought infection, which roots eased pain, and which mixtures could bring down a fever. This wasn't folklore. It was survival science passed through generations. Garlic was used as a natural antibiotic, eaten raw or infused into tonics. Honey, with its antimicrobial properties, was applied to wounds to prevent infection and speed healing. Willow bark, rich in salicin, was chewed or brewed into tea to reduce pain and inflammation, centuries before aspirin was invented. Vinegar served multiple roles: cleaning wounds, clearing ear infections, even mixed with herbs as a basic disinfectant. Onions were sliced and wrapped around limbs to draw out sickness, and poultices made from comfrey, plantain, or mugwort were applied to everything from burns to broken bones. These weren't miracle cures, but they worked often enough to become standard practice. Peasant women, especially elder matriarchs, acted as herbalists, midwives, and healers. They kept gardens full of medicinal plants and wildflowers. A sick child meant a carefully selected tea. A wounded husband meant a poultice and rest. Some techniques were shockingly advanced. Fermented cabbage, early sauerkraut, helped with digestion and vitamin C deficiency. Certain moldy breads were even applied to wounds. Primitive, yes, but not far off from how penicillin would be discovered centuries later. When no treatment worked, ritual stepped in. Prayers, chants, and symbolic actions offered emotional relief, because in times of deep suffering, belief itself could ease panic and create hope. Today, the same ingredients, honey, garlic, willow vinegar, are being re-evaluated by scientists and embraced by modern herbalists. Not as replacements for medicine, but as valuable allies in basic off-grid care. For peasants, these weren't home remedies. They were the only remedies. Defending a home with zero weapons. Most peasants didn't own swords, armor, or crossbows. They weren't knights, and they couldn't afford trained guards. But that didn't mean they were defenseless. When danger came, whether from bandits, raiders, or rival lords, they relied on improvisation, cooperation, and terrain. One of their first lines of defense was natural: bramble fences. Thick, thorny bushes like hawthorn or blackthorn were grown around homes or fields to form dense, painful barriers that were almost impossible to cross quietly. No swords needed, just time and patience. Ditches and uneven ground were also used strategically. Sloped approaches to homes made it harder for invaders to rush. In some areas, peasants built entrances that zigzagged, slowing movement and exposing attackers to counterstrikes from above. For close-range defense, they fashioned fire-hardened wooden spears, sharpened farm tools, and even clubs carved from oak roots. These tools weren't elegant, but they worked. Windows were small and set high, limiting points of entry. Doors were reinforced with iron nails or crossbars. Some homes even had drop holes above entrances, used to throw rocks, hot water, or boiling broth onto intruders. But perhaps the strongest defense was community. Villages organized watch systems, with neighbors taking turns guarding the outskirts. If an attack happened, a horn or bell was rung, and everyone responded, not just to fight, but to protect livestock, children, and stores of grain. Even the weakest member had a role, distracting, warning, or helping others escape. They also relied on psychological deterrence. Animal skulls placed near paths, loud barking dogs, or exaggerated signs of defense. Anything to make attackers hesitate. In siege conditions, the tactics scaled up. Peasants dug tunnels beneath fences, stored rocks on rooftops, and prepared escape routes into the woods or hills. Fighting wasn't always about weapons. It was about time, terrain, and teamwork. And in today's world, where many think defense means gear and gadgets, this kind of simple collective strategy might just be more powerful than it seems. Mental survival through rituals and belief. You can endure hunger. You can survive cold. But what keeps you going when it feels like the world is falling apart? For medieval peasants, survival wasn't just physical. It was mental. And they built inner strength through something deeper than tools, rituals, belief, and shared meaning. In times of crisis, crop failure, sickness, war, peasants didn't just wait in fear. They acted. Not always in ways we'd recognize as rational, but in ways that gave structure to the chaos around them. Seasonal rituals were central to their lives. The turning of the year, solstices, equinoxes, harvests, was marked with song, fire, and gathering. These weren't just celebrations. They were reminders that time moved forward, that winter wouldn't last forever, and that their suffering had a place in the larger rhythm of life. Community storytelling played a powerful role. Elders retold myths and folk tales that framed hardship as part of a grand story. A flood wasn't just bad luck. It was a test. A harsh winter wasn't just misery. It was something their ancestors had overcome. These stories gave suffering meaning, and that gave people strength. Religion, too, provided a framework for survival. Whether it was the Virgin Mary, local saints, or even pre-Christian traditions woven into daily life, peasants saw the world as a moral landscape. Doing the right thing mattered. Keeping faith in hard times wasn't just about salvation. It was a psychological anchor. Even simple, symbolic acts, like blessing a loaf of bread before a meal or lighting a candle on a stormy night, helped peasants reclaim a sense of control. These rituals were small, but powerful. And when death came, as it often did, ritual gave space to grieve, to remember, and to continue. Modern psychologists recognize this now. Belief, meaning, and community are some of the most important tools in any survival scenario. The peasants didn't read self-help books or attend resilience seminars. They survived because their minds were trained as well as their hands. The survival blueprint we forgot. They didn't call it prepping. They didn't call it off-grid. For peasants, it was just life. From harvesting rain without tools to preserving food underground, from heating homes without firewood to fighting illness without a pharmacy, every tactic was born from necessity and refined over generations. They didn't have luxury, they had resilience. And in a time where modern systems feel more fragile than ever, maybe it's time we stop laughing at the past and start learning from it. Because survival wasn't a trend for them. It was the only option. And if you found value in these strategies, you'll love our deep dive into how medieval survival skills are being revived today.